16-year-old Amara Lewis only wanted parts for her science fair project until a $2,000 tablet went missing and she was dragged away in handcuffs. What the mall guards and Officer Briggs didn't know? Her mother is Colonel Patrice Lewis, a decorated Delta Force commander at the Pentagon. What happens next will shock you. Subscribe now, hit that like button, and share this story, because justice can't stay silent. The ordinary Saturday that would soon erupt into headlines of injustice began with quiet determination in the heart of 16-year-old Amara Lewis, a black honors student whose mind thrived on numbers, circuits, and equations that most adults found intimidating. The clock read 10:30 a.m. when she left her family's modest Dallas home, a notebook filled with carefully sketched blueprints tucked under her arm, and her robotics team hoodie pulled snug against the brisk spring air. For weeks, she had been preparing for the National Robotics Science Fair, a competition that brought together the top 100 students from across the country. Each project judged not just for its design, but for its potential to impact real-world technology. Amara's entry, an autonomous solar-powered rover designed to deliver medical supplies in disaster zones, was her pride and proof of years of study. All she needed now were a handful of specialty parts, electronic sensors and microchips from TechMart Electronics, a sprawling store nestled between a luxury clothing boutique and a high-end furniture showroom in suburban Dallas. Her teachers said TechMart carried everything from capacitors to rare processors, and she had spent the past 3 nights cataloging the exact items, their serial numbers, and aisle placements so she could move quickly and efficiently. To anyone passing by, she was just another teenager in sneakers and jeans, her long braids pulled back so they wouldn't get in the way while she worked. But to Amara, this trip was part of her mission, a small but vital supply run, no different than astronauts gathering fuel before a launch. As she entered TechMart's gleaming glass doors, the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint static crackle of demo speakers filled the air. Rows of polished gadgets glowed under showroom lamps, their shiny surfaces reflecting the promise of innovation. She grabbed a red basket, slipped her headphones down around her neck, and began moving methodically down the aisles, her pencil ticking off each component from her handwritten list. 2 thermal resistors, 4 optical sensors, 1 Arduino processor. She whispered each item under her breath, her voice steady, her mind as precise as the machines she dreamed of building. But while Amara focused on wires and circuits, others in the store focused on something else entirely. Her skin, her presence, the way she didn't fit the imagined picture of a high-paying customer. The store clerk, a thin man in his 40s named Mark Whitfield, paused midway through arranging a row of headphones to watch her. His eyes narrowed not on the notebook in her hand, but on the hoodie she wore, and the fact she lingered at the electronics wall longer than a normal shopper. Every time she bent to examine a part, he adjusted his tie and moved closer, straightening boxes she hadn't touched, making his presence obvious. To him, her meticulous note-taking wasn't the sign of a serious student preparing for competition, but the suspicious behavior of someone plotting to steal. Still, Amara ignored the weight of his stare. She had grown up under the careful guidance of her mother, Colonel Patrice Lewis, a decorated Delta Force commander who had taught her that the world might try to shrink her brilliance into suspicion, but her duty was to keep her focus sharp. So she did. She flipped pages in her notebook, double-checked resistor codes, and carefully placed each part into her basket, as if she were assembling the bones of her future. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 50s strutted into the store, her heels clicking like gunfire against the polished tiles. Linda Carver, her diamond bracelet flashing under the showroom lights, carried shopping bags from luxury boutiques. Her eyes swept the store with the casual entitlement of someone used to being served first, noticed first, believed first. She barely glanced at the displays before she noticed Amara crouched near the processor shelf, comparing voltage tolerances. Linda's lips tightened. To her, Amara's presence was not that of a young scientist on the verge of discovery, but a lurking stranger whose very being disrupted her sense of order. As Amara crossed another item from her list, she felt the familiar prickle of eyes on her back. She looked up briefly to see both Whitfield and Linda watching her with narrowed gazes. She tucked her notebook closer to her chest, the way her mother had taught her to protect important documents, and moved on to the microchips section. She reminded herself of her mother's words spoken late at night, when the world's weight pressed too heavy. Stay focused, Amara. Your brilliance is your shield. Let the noise around you fade into the background. The noise didn't fade. It grew. Whitfield tapped into his radio, murmuring something she couldn't hear, as Linda shifted her bags conspicuously, patting each one as though counting items. A minute later, Amara heard Linda's voice cut through the soft store music like a siren. My tablet, my brand new tablet, $2,000 gone. Heads turned instantly. Customers glanced up from their browsing. Employees stiffened. And then Linda's manicured finger stabbed the air, pointing directly at Amara. It was her. She's been lurking here for 20 minutes. I knew she was up to something. For Amara, the moment was surreal, like a sudden glitch in her orderly machine. She blinked at Linda confused, then back at Whitfield, expecting him to at least ask questions. Instead, he nodded solemnly, as if her guilt had already been established by Linda's tone alone. The notebook in Amara's hand, filled with calculations and diagrams, suddenly felt heavier, like evidence twisted into an accusation. She opened her mouth, her voice steady, despite the tightening in her chest. Excuse me, ma'am, but I didn't take anything. I'm here for my science fair project. You can check my basket, my list, even call my teacher. Her words were cut off by Whitfield's raised hand. We'll handle this, ma'am, he said to Linda. Then into his radio security, we've got a theft situation in progress. Respond immediately. Within seconds, two mall security guards, Ethan Cole and Derek Shaw, appeared as if they'd been waiting nearby for exactly this moment. Their large frames filled the aisle as they stepped toward Amara, their voices clipped and dismissive. Let's go, miss. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Amara's heart pounded, but she clutched her notebook tighter. She tried once more. You're making a mistake. Please check the cameras. Check my basket. I didn't. Her protest was drowned out by the guards' voices. Save it. We hear this every day. Another one boosting electronics. As they gripped her arms, one on each side, the basket fell from her hands, spilling resistors and sensors across the floor, like shattered pieces of her dream. The humiliation burned hotter than the grip of their hands. Every head in the store turned. Customers whispered, some shaking their heads, others pulling out phones to record. Amara, once just another student chasing her dream, was now a spectacle. The walk through the mall felt like an eternity. Past the frozen yogurt stand, past families eating pretzels, past children tugging on their parents' hands, all eyes followed her not as a scholar or inventor, but as a suspect. In that humiliating parade, Amara remembered the words her mother drilled into her since she was 7. If you're ever stopped, keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Speak with dignity, even when others don't show you any. And so she did. She kept her chin high, her voice steady, her silence powerful, as the guards marched her toward the small gray-walled security office near the food court. The science fair, the notebook, the years of preparation, all of it blurred for a moment, under the crushing weight of suspicion and bias. Yet even then, a part of her mind whispered, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning." The echoes of her mother's training still hummed in Amara Lewis's mind. Stay calm, hold your ground. Let your dignity speak louder than your fear. When the moment that would change her ordinary Saturday into a national scandal exploded across the glossy aisles of TechMart electronics, it began with a sharp gasp that cut through the low hum of fluorescent lights and demo speakers. The voice belonged to Linda Carver, a woman in her early 50s draped in designer labels and entitlement, who clutched her designer handbag as though it had suddenly betrayed her. "My tablet," she cried, her voice rising an octave too high, calculated to draw attention. "My brand-new tablet, $1,500 gone." Her declaration sent ripples through the store. Shoppers glanced up from their browsing clerks, froze in mid-step, and all eyes followed the diamond bracelet on her raised hand as it glittered under the showroom lights. Then, with the practiced confidence of someone who expected to be believed without question, she jabbed her manicured finger toward Amara. "It was her. She's been lurking around for 20 minutes. I knew she was up to something." The accusation landed heavier than a gavel, drowning out the steady rhythm of Amara's note-taking and the quiet order of her Saturday morning. For a split second, she thought Linda must be pointing at someone else. Her a thief? She looked down at her own basket filled with nothing but electronic parts, resistors, sensors, microchips, all carefully listed and checked off against her handwritten notes. She had nothing that even resembled a tablet. Still the air shifted. Injustice has a way of making silence louder, and in that suspended breath, Amara felt every gaze tighten around her like invisible chains. She took a slow breath, steadying her voice, the way her mother had taught her, measured, clear, unshakable. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, holding Linda's gaze with surprising calm. "I didn't take anything. I'm here for my science project. You can check my basket, my list, even call my teacher." Her tone was polite, logical, respectful. The voice of a student accustomed to defending her work at competitions, not her character in public. But logic had no place in the theater of accusation Linda had staged. Before Amara's words could settle, Mark Whitfield, the store manager, appeared from behind a row of laptops. He was a wiry man in his 40s with thinning hair and a permanent frown etched into his face. Instead of asking for proof, instead of checking security footage, instead of even looking inside Linda's handbag, he nodded solemnly at the accuser. "We'll handle this, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth with practiced customer service. Then he turned toward Amara, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, not inquiry. "Stay right there." His tone carried the weight of assumption, guilty until proven otherwise. Amara opened her mouth to protest, but Whitfield was already raising his radio. "Security," he said briskly. "We've got a theft situation in progress. Respond immediately." His words sealed her fate in that moment. No investigation, no evidence, just Linda's finger and his instant agreement. Within less than a minute, 2 mall security guards appeared, their footsteps heavy and rehearsed, as if they had been waiting nearby for a cue. Ethan Cole and Derek Shaw, both tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in black tactical polos, moved toward Amara with the same precision as soldiers carrying out an order. They didn't ask questions. They didn't glance at her basket of wires and sensors. They didn't even pause to hear her explanation. To them, the presence of a black teenager near an affluent white woman's missing property was evidence enough. "Let's go, Miss Cole," barked, his grip closing around her right arm like a clamp. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." His partner Shaw seized her left arm, the force of his hand bruising, before she could even process what was happening. The basket tumbled from her fingers, resistors scattering like broken pieces of her dream across the polished floor. Amara tried again, her voice firm, though her heart hammered in her chest. "You're making a mistake. Please check the cameras. Check my basket." "I didn't take anything." But her words were drowned out by Shaw's dismissive chuckle. "We hear this every day." Another one boosting electronics. The humiliation struck hotter than the physical grip on her arms. She, the student, who had once stood on a stage accepting awards for innovation, the teenager whose science project had impressed engineers twice her age, was now paraded through the aisles like a criminal. Her NASA hoodie, once a badge of her ambition, now felt like a costume mocked by the suspicious stares of strangers. Every step toward the security office was agony, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that logic and truth were powerless against prejudice presented as procedure. Shoppers whispered as she passed. Some shook their heads, others pulled out phones to record. A child pointed at her and asked his mother, "What did she do?" The mother shushed him, her eyes locked on Amara, with a mixture of pity and judgment. The walk through the mall, past the frozen yogurt stand, past families sharing pretzels, past teenagers laughing at TikTok videos, felt like a march through an invisible trial, one where the verdict had already been written before evidence was even considered. Amara straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of composure drilled into her by her mother, Colonel Patrice Lewis. Since she was 7 years old, her mother had prepared her for this very moment with lessons no child should ever need. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully, even if they don't. Don't resist, even when you're right. Know your rights, but know they may not protect you in the moment. Those lessons now burned in her mind, each one a shield against the storm of humiliation. When they reached the gray metal door of the mall security office, Amara's wrists were already red from the guard's grip. Cole shoved the door open with his shoulder, steering her inside with unnecessary force. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant, its walls lined with grainy monitors streaming footage from every corner of the mall. The hum of machinery filled the silence as Shaw pushed her into a chair, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "Sit," he commanded. Amara sat, not because his tone demanded it, but because her mother's voice echoed louder in her memory. "Stay calm. Survive the moment. Truth will have its time." She kept her chin high, her eyes steady, her silence dignified. Whitfield entered behind them, his face smug with the satisfaction of a job handled. Linda Carver followed her heels, tapping smugly across the tile as she settled into a corner chair, her phone in hand, already scrolling as if she were the victim inconvenienced by the inconvenience of stolen property. In that suffocating office, the line between truth and accusation blurred into farce. A young girl with no record, no stolen item, no evidence against her, sat bleeding dignity in a chair, while grown adults performed prejudice as policy. And yet Amara knew this was not the end. Her calmness was not defeat, but defiance. Beneath the humiliation, beneath the sting of injustice, there flickered a steady flame. She had one phone call, one lifeline, one person who understood both the battlefield of war and the battlefield of bias. And once her mother's number was dialed, the quiet storm in that gray security office would explode into a reckoning no one inside could have predicted. The heavy silence in the mall's gray-walled security office was broken by the metallic click of the door swinging open. And in walked Officer Daniel Briggs, a man whose very posture carried arrogance like a second badge. He was in his mid-40s, his hair cropped into a regulation buzz cut, his chest slightly puffed, as if the weight of his service pistol was proof enough of authority. He had walked this beat for more than 20 years or so. He liked to remind people, and in that time he had developed a reputation quick to judgment, quicker to force, and always shielded by a system that labeled complaints against him as unsubstantiated. 12 official grievances had been filed, 9 of them from Black or Latino families, but each one vanished quietly into paperwork and closed-door meetings. To the public, he was just another officer responding to a call, but to those who knew him, Briggs represented something far darker, the embodiment of bias with a badge. He scanned the room with eyes the color of steel, lingering not on the woman who had shouted about her missing $1,500 tablet, not on the store manager who had failed to check security footage, but squarely on Amara Lewis, the 16-year-old honor student seated with her basket of scattered electronics parts at her feet. He rested his hand casually on the butt of his holstered Glock, the gesture less about safety and more about dominance, the kind of silent intimidation he wielded like a tool. So he drawled, ignoring Amara, as though she were invisible. "What do we have here?" Mark Whitfield was eager to please. "Caught this one stealing officer," he announced, puffing up as if he were being commended for bravery. "Customer's brand new tablet, high-end, about $1,500, witnessed and reported." His words came slick and fast, the narrative already shaped to cast Amara as guilty before the first shred of evidence was presented. Briggs nodded slowly, his lips curling into a smirk that had humiliated countless young people before. "Figures," he said, his voice tinged with contempt. Finally, his gaze flicked to Amara, and for the first time, he acknowledged her existence. "What's your story, huh? Let me guess you don't know anything about it. Just here, minding your own business, right?" The sarcasm dripped heavy. Amara took a deep breath, summoning the composure drilled into her by her mother. "Sir," she said evenly, "I didn't take anything. I'm an AP student at Westwood High. I came to buy parts for my robotics project. You can check my notebook, my basket, even call my teacher, Mr. Harrington. He'll confirm everything." She spoke with the clarity of someone used to defending her ideas in front of judges, but here in this office her voice was dismissed like static on a broken radio. Briggs snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. Science project, huh? Real original. You kids think you can talk your way out of trouble. But I've been on this job 20 years, and trust me, I know your kind." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. He didn't need to say more, everyone in the room understood what your kind meant. The racism wasn't hidden. It was weaponized, wielded as casually as the keys jingling on his belt. Without warning, Briggs reached for her basket, dumping its contents onto the metal table with careless force. Resistors rolled to the edge, notebooks fluttered open, and her neatly organized parts scattered like debris after an explosion. Her wallet flipped open in the chaos, revealing her school ID, her perfect attendance certificate, and even a commendation from her robotics team. But none of it mattered. Briggs shoved the documents aside with a dismissive grunt, rifling through her belongings as if searching for something that didn't exist. Finding no tablet, he narrowed his eyes, leaning closer. "Where'd you hide it?" he demanded. Amara sat straighter, refusing to cower. "I didn't take any tablet," she replied, her voice firm but calm. "There's no evidence, because there's nothing to find. You should check the security cameras. They'll show I didn't do anything wrong." From the corner, Linda Carver scoffed loudly, crossing her arms. "She probably has an accomplice. These people always work in groups." The casual venom of her words stung sharper than the fluorescent light above. Briggs nodded at her as if her prejudice confirmed his suspicions, and then with the kind of finality meant to strip away dignity, he pulled the cuffs from his belt. The metallic clink echoed like a verdict. "Until we sort this out, you're being detained for suspicion of theft." Amara felt the cold steel bite into her skin, as Briggs yanked her arms behind her back, locking the handcuffs far tighter than necessary. Pain seared up her wrists as the sharp metal edges cut into tender flesh. Tiny beads of blood formed almost instantly. She winced her breath, catching, but her voice remained steady. "These are too tight. They're cutting me." Briggs didn't respond. He tightened them once more for good measure, a cruel twist of his wrist, then stepped back with satisfaction. Whitfield looked away. Linda smirked, and the security guards shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The silence of complicity was deafening. Outside the small office, the scene had drawn attention. Through the narrow window, Amara could see shoppers gathering, whispering, raising phones to record. A mother pulled her young son closer, shielding him from the sight, while a group of teenagers watched wide-eyed, their screens glowing as they streamed the unfolding injustice live. Each camera captured the same image, a 16-year-old black girl in a NASA hoodie, wrists bleeding, treated like a dangerous criminal, while her basket of science parts lay scattered across the table. Her humiliation was no longer private. It was public, a spectacle. Yet even as her cheeks burned with the sting of injustice, Amara straightened her shoulders, summoning the unshakable discipline her mother had instilled in her since childhood. She lifted her chin, met Briggs's cold stare, and said evenly, "I'd like to make a phone call." "That's my right." Briggs raised an eyebrow, smirking again. "Oh, really? And who do you think you're gonna call your mom? Someone important." His voice dripped with sarcasm, the kind designed to break spirits. He leaned in close, his breath acrid with stale coffee. "Go ahead, make your call. Let's see how far your stories get you." Amara didn't flinch. Despite the pain, despite the blood running in thin lines down her wrists, despite the laughter of her accuser in the corner, she held his gaze with quiet strength. "Yes," she said, calmly. "I'm going to call my mother." The room erupted in mocking laughter. Whitfield chuckled nervously. Linda threw her head back with derision. Even Briggs allowed himself a smirk so wide it revealed yellowed teeth. "And who's mommy supposed to be, a senator?" "The mayor." His voice carried the smugness of a man who had no idea he was moments away from shattering his own career. Amara's reply cut through their laughter like a blade. "Colonel Patrice Lewis," she said firmly, her words crisp as steel. "Delta Force, stationed at the Pentagon." The laughter swelled louder, Linda nearly choking on her amusement, Whitfield muttering, "Nice try," under his breath. But Amara didn't waver. She repeated the number with steady precision, watching Briggs's smirk falter ever so slightly as he picked up her phone. In that moment, as the phone began to ring, Amara knew what her mother had always told her was true. Dignity is its own weapon. And though the cuffs dug deeper into her bleeding skin, though the humiliation pressed down like a storm, she sat taller, her silence cutting sharper than words. Because in less than 30 minutes, the battlefield of that mall security office would change forever. The laughter in the cramped, gray-walled security office swelled like a chorus of derision bouncing off the humming monitors and sterile walls. But Amara Lewis did not shrink beneath it. Her wrists stung with every heartbeat, the handcuffs biting deeper into her skin, thin trails of blood smearing across her NASA hoodie sleeve. She ignored the throbbing pain and sat straighter in the metal chair, her face calm, her eyes sharp, her posture radiating a dignity that none of her captors seemed capable of recognizing. The smirks and sneers surrounding her were nothing new. Her mother had told her since she was a child that the world would sometimes mistake her brilliance for arrogance, her composure for guilt, her very presence for a threat. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was the truth waiting on the other side of a phone call. And so, with the kind of steady defiance only 16 years of discipline and preparation could produce, Amara lifted her chin and declared, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. "My mother is Colonel Patrice Lewis, United States Army Delta Force stationed at the Pentagon." The words cut through the tension like a blade. For one electric moment, the room fell silent. Even Officer Daniel Briggs, who had been so smug his hand casually resting near his holstered Glock, blinked in surprise before a sneer slithered across his face. He leaned back slightly, folding his arms as if to cage in his disbelief. "And my dad's the president," he shot back, his tone dripping with mockery. The chuckle that followed was the laugh of a man convinced of his own superiority, a laugh sharpened by 2 decades of unchecked bias and abuse. Linda Carver, still seated primly in the corner, with her diamond bracelet catching the light, let out a sharp laugh of her own, the kind of high-pitched titter that belonged in cocktail lounges, not courtrooms. She glanced at her phone as though Amara's words were nothing more than a punchline to text about later. "Delta Force," she scoffed. "That's rich." Mark Whitfield, the store manager, adjusted his thinning hair nervously, but joined in the mockery, offering a weak laugh that barely concealed his eagerness to side with whoever held power. "Sure, kid," he said, "and I'm the governor of Texas." The laughter swirled around her, cruel and dismissive, but Amara sat steady, unflinching. The humiliation burned hot under her skin, but beneath it flowed something stronger, the training her mother had drilled into her from the age of 7. The lessons weren't abstract, they were rehearsals for survival. Nights at the kitchen table where Colonel Lewis, still in uniform after 14-hour shifts at the Pentagon, would lean across and say, "If you're ever accused, if you're ever cornered, don't panic, don't shout, stay calm. The calmer you are, the more their rage condemns them, not you." So Amara did exactly that. Her voice didn't crack. Her shoulders didn't slump. Instead, she nodded slightly, letting the laughter exhaust itself before she spoke again. "That's her number," she said evenly, her tone measured and controlled. "Dial it, if you don't believe me." Briggs's eyes narrowed. He expected tears, pleas, or silence. Instead, he was confronted with a teenager who carried herself with the composure of a soldier. He picked up the phone almost mockingly, his smirk daring her to expose her lie. "Fine," he said. "Let's see this Colonel Mother of yours." His thumb hovered over the screen, ready to expose what he believed was a childish bluff. But Amara didn't flinch. She recited the digits clearly, each number crisp and precise, like a cadence drilled into her memory. Her voice betrayed no fear, only resolve. 202555961. Each syllable landed with the weight of inevitability, and as Briggs pressed call, the mocking laughter faltered ever so slightly, replaced by a faint current of unease. On the other end, at that very moment, in the secure corridors of the Pentagon, Colonel Patrice Lewis sat in a briefing room surrounded by generals and intelligence officers. Satellite images of foreign terrain glowed on a wall-sized screen, the kind of images she had spent her career analyzing, the kind of briefings that decided the safety of thousands. She had served 3 tours in hostile zones, led covert operations across 2 continents, and earned decorations that few women and fewer black women had ever held. But no battlefield, no mission, no calculated risk had ever prepared her for the vibration of the secure phone in her pocket, showing one name, Amara. Her daughter never called during school hours unless something was wrong. Maternal instinct cut sharper than military protocol. "Excuse me, generals," she said, rising to her feet, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced mortar fire without flinching. "Family emergency." They nodded respectfully, accustomed to her efficiency, and she stepped into the hallway, pressing the phone to her ear. Zora. She answered automatically, using her daughter's middle name as she often did in private moments. But what she heard wasn't the cheerful chatter of a student between classes. It was silence first, then the controlled voice of a child in distress, a voice trained to sound calm even when chaos reigned. Mom Amara said, her words clipped, her tone deliberate. "I'm being detained at TechMart Electronics in Dallas. A woman accused me of stealing. They won't check the cameras. An officer handcuffed me. Too tight. My wrists are bleeding. They're laughing at me for saying who you are." Colonel Lewis stopped walking. The world around her narrowed to a single focus, the way it had in combat zones when seconds meant survival. She didn't shout, didn't panic. Her voice dropped into the low register that had steadied soldiers in firefights. "Are you safe right now?" "I'm in the mall security office, surrounded." Amara paused, her breath hitching slightly. "But I'm calm like you taught me." The words pierced Patrice's chest with equal parts pride and fury. She could picture her daughter, brilliant, composed, wrists bleeding, and it ignited a cold fire inside her. "Good," she said softly. "Stay calm. Give them nothing. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Briggs leaned closer to the phone, his smirk returning when he heard the calm military tone on the other end. "And who am I speaking to?" he asked, his voice taunting. The reply was steady, crisp, undeniable. "Colonel Patrice Lewis, United States Army Delta Force, stationed at the Pentagon." For the first time, Briggs hesitated. The laughter in the room faltered. Even Linda lowered her phone from her face. There was no quiver in the colonel's voice, no hint of exaggeration. It was the sound of command, the sound of authority earned through blood and fire. "I suggest you identify yourself properly," Colonel Lewis continued, her voice like tempered steel. "And while you do remove those restraints from my daughter, before this escalates beyond your control." The silence that followed was heavy. Whitfield shifted nervously, his earlier bravado crumbling. Linda fumbled with her bracelet, suddenly fascinated by the floor. But Briggs forced a chuckle, clinging to his arrogance like a drowning man to driftwood. "Playing the military card doesn't change anything," he muttered, though his tone lacked its earlier swagger. Amara sat straighter, her lips pressed into a thin line of quiet triumph. For all their sneers, for all their disbelief, the truth had been spoken, and now it hung in the air, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Her wrists still bled, her humiliation still burned, but her resolve remained unshaken. She had made the call. She had invoked the one name, the one force, the one presence in her life that no smirk, no sneer, no false accusation could withstand. In less than 30 minutes, the battlefield of that small office would be unrecognizable because Colonel Patrice Lewis, decorated Delta Force commander, Pentagon strategist, and above all, a mother, was already on her way. The steady, disciplined heartbeat of the Pentagon thrummed through the walls as Colonel Patrice Lewis strode out of the secure briefing room, her boots clicking against the polished floor with the controlled rhythm of someone trained to keep pace under mortar fire. Just moments before, she had been seated among four-star generals and senior intelligence officers reviewing satellite imagery of insurgent activity in Eastern Europe. Maps glowed on massive screens, strategy notes scrolled in real time, and every word spoken in that room carried the weight of national security. Yet, when her secure phone vibrated in her pocket with her daughter's number, Patrice knew instantly, instinctively, that the real battlefield was not overseas. It was in Dallas. It was her 16-year-old daughter, handcuffed and bleeding, sitting in a mall security office while being mocked for daring to speak her truth. For a soldier who had faced fire across 2 continents, nothing in that briefing could have prepared her for the fury surging now. It was a fury she did not wear on her face, because fury without control is reckless. Instead, her features remained calm, her posture tall, her voice clipped as she excused herself with 3 words spoken like an order family emergency generals. Once in the hallway, she pressed the phone tight to her ear and listened again to Amara's trembling but controlled report, accused detained wrists bleeding. Patrice's jaw flexed. She closed her eyes briefly, summoning every ounce of Delta Force discipline. Cold fury, not hot. Precision, not chaos. She could not storm this battlefield unprepared. She had to mobilize, and she had to do it the way she had survived every combat zone with allies' tactics and unrelenting focus. Her first call went to Major Denise Hall, a sharp-eyed attorney in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, who had been her ally since Ranger School days. Denise was known for her ability to dismantle legal arguments with surgical precision, a woman who carried statutes and precedents the way soldiers carried rifles. Denise Patrice said, her voice low and urgent, "Amara's been detained at TechMart in Dallas. False accusation. They're mocking her refusing to check cameras. Officer applied restraints hard enough to draw blood. I want you there. Now. Bring every statute you need to shut this down." There was no hesitation on the other end, only the crisp affirmation of a fellow warrior. "Understood. I'll meet you on site within the hour. I'll have the documentation in hand." The next call was to Captain Jordan Ruiz Military Police, decorated for his ability to maintain composure in crises that rattled lesser men. Jordan was younger than Patrice, but deeply loyal, one of the few she trusted without question. "Jordan, I need a medical kit and a team. My daughter's been cuffed and injured. TechMart Electronics, suburban Dallas. Secure the scene when you arrive." Jordan didn't ask for details, didn't waste a second. "Copy that, Colonel. I'll assemble a unit and converge. We'll treat her and document everything." Her final call before leaving the Pentagon was to her commanding general, a man who had fought beside her in 2 operations overseas. His voice, gravelly with age and battle experience, answered on the first ring. "Colonel Lewis, what's your status?" She didn't soften the details. "Sir, my daughter has been racially profiled, detained without cause, injured by a Dallas officer. This has escalated into civil rights territory. I'm requesting emergency leave, and if necessary, full legal and military support. I will not stand down." A long silence filled the line, not of doubt, but of calculation. Then came the answer, "Granted. Take what you need. Keep me informed. And Colonel, give them hell." Patrice allowed herself a single deep breath, the kind she had taken in deserts, before raids in jungles, before extractions. She strode to her office, stripped off the formal Pentagon jacket, and changed into civilian clothes, dark jeans, a crisp black shirt, and a tailored blazer. Nothing ostentatious, but every line of her posture, every controlled motion radiated command that no clothing could disguise. She slid her military ID into her pocket, visible enough to present concealed enough not to be a first weapon. She strapped a tactical watch to her wrist, tucked a compact first aid kit into her bag, and scanned her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were steel. Her jaw was set. This was not just a mother going to collect her daughter. This was a commander going to a battlefield. The drive from Washington, D.C. to Dallas would take over 24 hours, but for Patrice, logistics had always been part of the mission. Within 15 minutes of her call, a military transport jet had been cleared at Andrews Air Force Base. By 1100 hours, she was airborne, seated upright, in the dim cabin of a C-37 jet. Her laptop open, her fingers, moving with tactical efficiency, as she drafted orders, emailed legal contacts, and mapped the mall's layout based on blueprints Major Hall had already secured. She studied the schematics with the same intensity she had once given insurgent compounds. Entrances, exits, camera placements, choke points, all of it mattered. To Patrice, TechMart, electronics was no longer a store. It was enemy terrain, and her daughter was pinned down inside it. As the engines roared beneath her, she allowed herself one memory: Amara, at 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, a Lego robot in her lap, eyes glowing with determination. "I'm going to build something that helps people," she had said, her small voice ringing with certainty. Patrice had bent down, kissed the top of her daughter's head, and replied, "Then I'll make sure the world doesn't stop you." Today those words felt less like a promise, and more like a vow carved into stone. By the time the jet touched down in Texas, it was 1,400 hours, the sun high and merciless over the Dallas skyline. Patrice stepped out onto the tarmac, her allies already converging Major Hall with a leather briefcase stuffed with legal documents. Captain Ruiz with a medical kit strapped across his chest and 2 MPs in tow. They saluted her instinctively, but she waved it off with the efficiency of someone who had no time for ceremony. "We move," she said simply. The convoy of black SUVs that met them cut through Dallas traffic with military precision. Patrice rode in the front seat, her eyes fixed on the GPS, as if it were battlefield coordinates. Her breathing was steady, her hands folded tightly over her knees. Outwardly, she was calm, composed, unreadable. Inwardly, every second stretched like a taut wire, her mind cycling through scenarios: what she would find, how Amara would look, whether Briggs would escalate further. She imagined the cuffs biting into her daughter's wrists, the way Amara's chin must have lifted against the laughter. It fueled her like jet fuel, sharpening her focus. This wasn't just another mission. This was the mission. She had led soldiers into firefights, had extracted civilians from hostile zones, had neutralized threats under the cover of darkness. But never had she felt the weight she carried now, the weight of a mother who knew her child was in enemy hands. At 14:30, the mall came into view, sprawling glass and steel, glinting under the Texas sun. The parking lot shimmered with heat waves, shoppers flowing in and out, oblivious to the storm about to break inside. Patrice checked her watch, her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned to Major Hall. 5 minutes behind me. Watch how they act when they think I'm just another black mother. Hall nodded, understanding instantly. Patrice opened the SUV door and stepped out her blazer, catching the wind, her stride unhurried, but lethal in its precision. She adjusted her posture, scanned the crowd with tactical awareness, and fixed her gaze on the mall entrance. Every muscle in her body was poised, every nerve steeled. To the untrained eye, she was just a civilian mother entering a mall. To those who had ever served under her, she was a commander walking onto a battlefield. This was not just about Amara anymore. This was about every child humiliated in silence, every parent powerless against a system stacked against them. Colonel Patrice Lewis had mobilized, and once she crossed that threshold, nothing, not smirks, not sneers, not the arrogance of an officer with 20 years of bias, would stand unchallenged. The mall's automatic glass doors parted with a muted hiss at exactly 14:35 hours, and though Colonel Patrice Lewis wore nothing more than dark jeans, a crisp black blouse, and a tailored blazer, her entrance radiated the kind of lethal command presence that years in Delta Force had forged into her very bones. Shoppers didn't know who she was, but their bodies reacted instinctively, straightening, moving aside, falling silent for a beat, as if something unseen but undeniable had entered their space. Her stride was measured, unhurried each step, a deliberate act of control, her eyes scanning the concourse with the tactical awareness of a soldier stepping into a hostile zone. She marked exits, security cameras, and the shifting clusters of people who had already gathered, murmuring about the detained teenager in the NASA hoodie. Inside the gray-walled security office, Officer Daniel Briggs still leaned smugly against the table, arms crossed the steel handcuffs biting into Amara's wrists as she sat composed but bleeding in the metal chair. Linda Carver tapped impatiently at her phone while Mark Whitfield shuffled nervously, glancing at the monitors. The atmosphere of arrogance that had filled the room moments before began to dissipate when the door opened and Patrice stepped inside without knocking. The silence was immediate, a vacuum of sound, as every eye fixed on her. Her gaze went first to Amara. Her daughter's wrists were raw streaks of red, cutting across the skin, where metal had dug mercilessly deep. Amara lifted her chin, her face composed, despite the pain. And for a heartbeat, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, mother and daughter, exchanging a wordless message. I am holding on. You came. Patrice's nostrils flared. Her fury banked beneath layers of soldiers' discipline, but it was there, sharp as a blade, cold as the steel she'd carried in combat. Then Patrice turned her attention to Briggs. She didn't shout. She didn't gesture. Her voice, when it came, was even clipped and devastatingly precise. Remove those handcuffs from my daughter. Now, Briggs blinked. He had expected another furious parent to belittle and dismiss. Instead, he was confronted with a woman whose tone carried the weight of authority, far beyond his 20 years of patrolling shopping centers and side streets. Ma'am, he said, forcing confidence into his voice, your daughter is being detained for theft. We'll handle the cuffs once we've finished questioning her. Patrice's eyes narrowed. She took a single step closer, her presence filling the small office like a storm front. Officer Briggs, she said, her voice cutting across his like the crack of a whip. You have violated multiple regulations. You have applied restraints to a minor, without evidence ignored requests to review security footage, and tightened handcuffs in a manner that has caused visible injury. You are currently in breach of department policy, state law, and federal statutes governing the detainment of juveniles. She didn't raise her voice, but the precision of her words hit harder than a shout. Briggs's smirk faltered, though he tried to cling to arrogance. And how exactly would you know our regulations, ma'am? He asked, his tone edging on mockery. Without hesitation, Patrice reached into her blazer and withdrew her military identification, placing it on the table with the deliberate finality of a judge's gavel. Colonel Patrice Lewis, she announced, her voice carrying the clipped cadence of command. United States Army Delta Force stationed at the Pentagon. Level 8 security clearance. Now remove those handcuffs. The room chilled. Whitfield paled, his earlier bravado draining from his face. Linda Carver shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by the floor. Even the security guards who had flanked Amara straightened their eyes, darting between Briggs and the ID card that glowed with undeniable authority. Briggs swallowed, his jaw tightening. Playing the military card doesn't change procedure, he muttered, though his voice lacked the swagger it had held moments before. Patrice didn't so much as blink. This is not a card, officer. It is fact. And procedure, as you well know, does not include public humiliation, denial of evidence review, or physical injury inflicted upon a minor. You will remove those restraints. You will provide immediate medical attention. And you will call your chief before I do. As if on cue, the door opened again, admitting Major Denise Hall, crisp in her JAG uniform, a leather briefcase in hand. She surveyed the scene with the cool detachment of a courtroom veteran, her eyes settling briefly on Amara, before locking on Briggs. Colonel Lewis, she greeted, her voice professional, but edged with urgency. I have drafted the motions for unlawful detainment, civil rights violations, and excessive use of force. Would you like me to file now or after the cuffs come off? Briggs blinked at her, thrown by the seamless arrival of legal muscle. His mouth opened, but before he could form a reply, the door opened once more. Captain Jordan Ruiz entered in full military police uniform, a medical kit slung across his shoulder. He didn't waste a second on introductions. He went directly to Amara, kneeling by her side, as he carefully inspected the damage. These cuts are consistent with restraints applied far tighter than regulation allows, he said loudly enough for the room to hear his gloved hands moving with precision. Documenting for record. He snapped photos, swabbed the blood, and began applying sterile dressings. The air in the room shifted palpably. The arrogance that had once filled it was now suffocated beneath the crushing weight of documentation, authority, and truth. Whitfield coughed, fumbling for words. This is a misunderstanding." Patrice turned her gaze on him, and he stopped mid-sentence. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, her tone like ice, "your store policy requires verification through security footage before detainment. Has that footage been reviewed?" He faltered. "Well, no, but we had a witness." "And that witness," Patrice interrupted smoothly, "is the same individual who has now filed multiple complaints of theft against young people of color, all dismissed when evidence proved otherwise. Shall we discuss perjury under oath?" Linda's face flushed crimson, and she sank lower in her seat, her earlier confidence dissolving into silence. The dynamic had shifted entirely. The officers, guards, and staff who had once dismissed Amara as invisible now found themselves cornered by the unrelenting clarity of Patrice's authority. Every word she spoke dismantled their false narrative. Every ally's arrival strengthened her position, and every documented injury carved another line of accountability into the record. For the first time, Briggs's hand slipped from his holster. He no longer leaned casually against the table. He stood rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting between Patrice Hall and Ruiz. He had spent 2 decades sneering at parents, mocking their pleas, twisting their words into excuses. But now confronted by a decorated Delta Force colonel, a JAG attorney, and a military police captain, all aligned, all relentless, he realized he was no longer in control. He was outnumbered, outflanked, and outmatched. Amara, watching from her chair, felt the shift like oxygen flooding back into a suffocating room. The pain in her wrists remained, but it no longer defined her. She lifted her chin higher, her eyes meeting her mother's, and for the first time since Linda's finger had pointed at her, she felt the tide turning. The mall staff exchanged uneasy glances. The guards shifted their weight. Whitfield tugged at his collar. Linda stared at the floor. And Briggs' sweat, gathering at his temple, finally understood. The girl he had mocked, the child he had shackled, was not alone. She had summoned a force he could neither intimidate nor silence. Colonel Patrice Lewis had arrived, and the battlefield no longer belonged to him. The walls of the TechMart security office, once a cage for Amara Lewis, now felt like the stage of a courtroom, each monitor, each file, each word, adding to the mounting weight of truth. The power shift that began with Colonel Patrice Lewis's entrance had cracked the foundation of arrogance in the room, but what came next shattered it entirely. Major Denise Hall set her briefcase on the table with a sharp click and drew out a stack of legal papers, her eyes cool as she spoke. "Before we move further, we will review the security footage. Now." There was no room for debate in her tone. The mall's head of security, summoned nervously by the escalating chaos, fumbled with his keycard and began cueing the feeds. Every flickering screen on the wall suddenly came alive with time-stamped footage from minutes earlier inside the store. The room fell into a tense silence as the truth unfolded in real time. On the grainy screen, Linda Carver appeared, her designer handbag hanging from her arm as she browsed a display. The footage showed her carefully sliding her sleek, gold-trimmed tablet into her own bag, glancing around furtively before walking a few steps away. She paused, scanned the aisle, then turned sharply, her face contorted in faux panic, as she clutched the handbag dramatically and began searching. The timestamp confirmed it 5 minutes before she accused Amara. Linda had hidden the device herself. The evidence was damning irrefutable. A ripple of reaction filled the room. Whitfield's face drained of color, his earlier bravado collapsing into stammered excuses. This could be misinterpreted, he muttered, but the words fell flat, lifeless against the glaring reality on screen. Linda herself stiffened her hands, tightening around the strap of her bag, her eyes darting wildly as though searching for an escape. That's not what it looks like. She snapped, her voice shrill with desperation. But it was exactly what it looked like. Major Hall's voice sliced through Linda's denial. Ms. Carver, planting evidence and filing false reports are felonies. Combined with prior patterns, this is not merely a mistake, it's a criminal act. Her words rang like a gavel striking wood. Colonel Lewis's eyes fixed on Linda with unflinching steel. "You weaponized your privilege against a child," she said, her voice calm but edged with lethal fury. "You pointed your finger at my daughter knowing the power it carried. That ends today." As if on cue, Captain Ruiz, who had been quietly working on his tablet, raised his head. "Colonel Major, there's more." His voice carried the quiet weight of revelation. He projected a new file onto one of the Monitor's mall incident reports tied to Linda Carver's name. 7 complaints in the past 14 months. 7 accusations, all against young people of color. In every case, items were later found in her own possession or elsewhere. In every case, security had detained the accused. No charges had stuck, but no accountability had ever followed. The room's atmosphere thickened into a suffocating silence. Even the guards, Ethan Cole and Derek Shaw, exchanged uneasy glances. One of them shifted on his feet, guilt flickering across his face. Whitfield tried again, his voice cracking. We thought she was a credible customer." Captain Ruiz cut him off, his tone razor sharp. "Credible? You detained 7 minors based solely on her word. You ignored evidence. You chose bias over truth. That is not credibility. That is complicity." Whitfield's hands trembled as he reached for his tie, tugging at it as though it might loosen the noose tightening around his own neck. But the unraveling wasn't finished. Ruiz tapped again at his tablet. "I pulled internal communications, Colonel," he said. "Emails, staff meeting recordings. Here's one from last quarter." He projected the memo onto the screen. The text was stark, unambiguous. "Pay close attention to kids who don't look like they belong. Don't waste time shadowing the regular customers." Beneath it signed Mark Whitfield, store manager. The words hung in the air like poison. Everyone in the room read them in silence. Whitfield stumbled back a step, his mouth opening and closing with useless protests. That was taken out of context. He sputtered. I meant suspicious behavior, not." Colonel Lewis stepped closer, her presence filling the room with icy authority. "You meant exactly what you wrote. Kids who don't look like they belong. You didn't write suspicious behavior. You wrote a profile, a racial profile, and you enforced it." Her words struck like hammer blows, each syllable cracking the fragile defense Whitfield clung to. And still, Ruiz wasn't done. He glanced toward Briggs, whose face had grown stormy, his jaw tight with resentment. Colonel Ruiz said, his voice deliberate. "I cross-referenced Officer Briggs's personnel file. It contains 12 complaints of excessive force." He paused for effect, letting the number echo in the room. 9 of those involved minority suspects. all dismissed without full investigation, all buried in internal review. The revelation detonated like a bomb. Whitfield sagged against the wall. Linda muttered incoherently, her earlier smugness obliterated. The guards stared at the floor, suddenly ashamed of their own silence. And Briggs's hand twitched near his belt, the old instinct to intimidate with his holster bubbling to the surface. But he stopped himself, realizing the trap had snapped shut around him. Major Hall was merciless. 12 complaints, dozens of violations, patterns of force applied disproportionately to minorities. And you thought you could bury it forever. She leaned forward, her eyes locking on Briggs. Not today. Not anymore. Amara, still seated, though now treated gently by Ruiz's medics, watched the cascade of truth with quiet awe. For the first time since Linda's false accusation, she felt the weight lifting not entirely, but enough to let her breathe more freely. She flexed her bandaged wrists, the pain sharp, but behind her calm eyes burned something stronger: vindication. Colonel Lewis turned her gaze back to Briggs, her voice low but powerful. You mocked my daughter for telling the truth. You assumed her words carried no weight. But now every word she spoke has been confirmed. You thought you were in control. You are not. Not anymore. Briggs shifted his stance, sweat beading along his hairline. He had strutted into the room with the swagger of untouchable authority, but now he found himself staring at a colonel backed by a JAG attorney, a military police captain, and an unassailable stack of evidence. For the first time in 20 years of unchecked arrogance, he understood fear, not the fear of violence, but the fear of accountability. Outside, through the narrow window, the crowd of shoppers had grown larger. Phones glowed as news spread. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into outrage. Word was already leaving the walls of TechMart, spilling into social media, into the streets beyond. The system of lies and silence that had once shielded people like Briggs Whitfield and Linda Carver was cracking wide open under the weight of exposure. Inside, the unraveling continued. Documents piled on the table. Screens glowed with damning proof. Every lie told that morning collapsed under the precision of facts, wielded like weapons. And at the center of it all sat Amara Lewis, 16 years old, wrists raw, posture unbroken, the quiet, undeniable proof that dignity and truth could outlast humiliation. The room had transformed from a chamber of ridicule into a crucible of reckoning. And everyone knew this was only the beginning. The unraveling inside the gray security office did not stay contained within its four walls. Truth, once unleashed, rarely does. By the time the damning footage of Linda Carver hiding her own tablet was reviewed, and the memo signed by Mark Whitfield was read aloud, the story had already broken free, carried in the palms of dozens of hands gripping glowing phones. A short video, 37 seconds long, captured by a teenage bystander, showed Amara Lewis, 16 years old, seated in a metal chair, wrists bound so tightly by handcuffs that blood streaked down her hoodie sleeves. She did not scream, did not thrash. Instead, she sat upright, calm, her NASA sweatshirt front, and center her voice steady, as she declared, "These cuffs are too tight. I did not steal anything. Please check the cameras." Officer Daniel Briggs, looming above her with a smirk, dismissed her words. That video spread across social media like fire leaping through dry brush, and within an hour, the hashtag #Justice for Amara was trending across the nation. By 1500 hours, crowds had begun to gather outside Westfield Mall in suburban Dallas. At first, a handful of classmates from Westwood High appeared, clutching hastily made signs, "Believe students, not stereotypes," and "Science, not suspicion." Then teachers arrived, followed by veterans who had served with Colonel Patrice Lewis, followed by families who had their own stories of profiling and humiliation in the same mall. The numbers swelled from dozens to hundreds in less than 90 minutes. Chants echoed against the glass facade of TechMart Justice for Amara. Justice for Amara. The sound carried through the mall, vibrating the very floor beneath the security office, where Whitfield sat, pale and trembling. Inside, tension sharpened as the crowd outside grew louder. The mall's regional manager, called in by frantic employees, tried to downplay the situation. "This is bad for business," he muttered. But Colonel Lewis's eyes cut through him like a blade. "This isn't business," she replied coldly. "This is justice." At 15:45, the sound of sirens split the air, and two black and white patrol SUVs rolled into the parking lot, followed by an unmarked cruiser bearing the insignia of the Dallas Police Department's Chief of Police, Robert Garcia. Chief Garcia was not a man easily rattled. Decades of service had hardened his features into a mask of control. But as he stepped out and saw the swelling crowd, the chanting students, the media vans lined up with satellite dishes pointed skyward, he knew immediately this was not a routine incident. This was a flashpoint. The chief entered TechMart, flanked by two senior officers. The security office went silent as his presence filled the space. His eyes swept the room, absorbing the sight of Amara, with bandaged wrists, Patrice standing tall with military poise, Whitfield shrinking in the corner, Linda Carver refusing to meet his gaze, and Briggs stiff with barely concealed defiance. Chief Garcia's jaw tightened. He turned toward Briggs, his voice calm but deadly serious. "Officer Briggs, remove your badge and your weapon. Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending an internal investigation." Briggs froze, disbelief flashing across his face. "Chief, this is a misunderstanding. I was just following procedure." Garcia cut him off. "Which procedure authorizes you to cuff a minor so tightly she bleeds? Which procedure allows you to ignore evidence that would have cleared her? Which procedure tells you to treat a 16-year-old honor student like a criminal in front of the entire mall?" The questions came like hammer blows, leaving Briggs no room to answer. Slowly, his face twisted in suppressed rage, he placed his service weapon and badge on the table. For the first time in 20 years, he was stripped of the authority he had abused so often. The news spread instantly. By the time Garcia's words reached the ears of the crowd outside, the chants doubled in volume, echoing into the Dallas sky. "Suspend Briggs." Suspend Briggs camera crews caught the moment live, broadcasting across evening news channels nationwide. Inside TechMart's corporate response team arrived three attorneys in tailored suits, carrying sleek briefcases and rehearsed smiles. The lead counsel, a woman named Jennifer Haynes, cleared her throat as if she could will the chaos back into boardroom order. "Colonel Lewis," she began smoothly on behalf of TechMart, "I want to extend our deepest apologies for this regrettable misunderstanding. We are prepared to offer a substantial settlement package immediately, 7 figures with a trust for Amara's education, along with policy reviews. All we ask in return is a standard non-disclosure agreement to allow all parties to move forward without further disruption." Her words dripped with corporate polish, but they landed like poison. The idea was clear: buy silence, bury the story, protect the brand. Colonel Lewis didn't blink. She stepped forward, her shoulders squared, her voice carrying the same controlled authority that had steadied soldiers in firefights overseas. "My daughter's blood is on those handcuffs. Her name has been dragged through humiliation. And you call this a misunderstanding?" She let the silence sharpen her words before continuing. "This isn't about money. This isn't about protecting your reputation. This is about accountability." Haynes adjusted her pearl necklace, her smile faltering. "Colonel, with respect, This incident could drag on in litigation for years. A settlement allows your family privacy, avoids. Patrice's eyes hardened. Privacy. Do you know how many children were humiliated here before my daughter? 7 complaints tied to this woman, she gestured toward Linda, ignored. Dozens of complaints against this officer buried. And you think you can cut a check and bury this one too? No. This ends now. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even Whitfield, sweating profusely in the corner, seemed to understand that no settlement could undo what was unfolding. The presence of Major Hall with legal documents, Captain Ruiz, documenting every injury, and the growing roar of the protest outside had transformed the balance of power. TechMart's attorneys, once confident in their ability to smother scandal, now looked like soldiers caught on the wrong side of the battlefield. Meanwhile, outside, the protest had swelled to nearly 500 people by dusk. Local pastors arrived with megaphones, veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with high school students, and handmade signs waved in the warm Dallas air, "Protect our kids, bias is not, policy justice for Amara." The crowd chanted in unison, their voices rising, as dusk turned to evening, a collective roar that no wall of glass could contain. Inside, Amara herself, still seated, but no longer alone, lifted her chin and spoke for the first time since the chief's arrival. Her voice was soft, but steady, every word cutting through the tension. "I don't want this to disappear. I don't want them to do this to someone else who doesn't have a mother in Delta Force. We have to see this through." Her words were a spark in the room, igniting resolve. Major Hall nodded firmly. "Then we'll file civil rights charges. Every violation, every policy ignored, every injury documented. They won't bury this. Not this time." Chief Garcia, arms crossed, inclined his head. "The department will cooperate fully. Officer Briggs will answer for this, and so will everyone who protected him." His voice carried the authority of someone determined to clean his own house, aware of the cameras recording outside, but more aware of the truth pressing within. Jennifer Haynes closed her briefcase, her corporate composure fractured. "Then we have nothing further to discuss at this time," she said stiffly. She and her team retreated, leaving behind the weight of a system that had finally met resistance it couldn't silence. Colonel Lewis watched them leave, then turned to her daughter. She reached down gently, squeezing Amara's bandaged hand. "This isn't just about us anymore," she said quietly. "This is about every family that walked into this mall and left in shame. Today, they're going to see what happens when we refuse to be silent." And outside, as the chants grew louder, as the crowd surged to nearly 1,000 by nightfall, as the hashtag #Chachicharan Justice for Amara lit up feeds from Dallas to D.C., it became clear this was no longer a local incident. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The roar of protest that shook the glass walls of Westfield Mall that night did not fade into silence. It became the opening note of a symphony of accountability. In the weeks that followed, the weight of evidence, the viral footage, and the relentless presence of Colonel Patrice Lewis and her allies transformed Amara's humiliation into a legal reckoning. When the case reached court, the truth no longer flickered on security screens. It blazed under oath. Jurors watched the footage of Linda Carver sliding her own $1,500 tablet into her bag before pointing a manicured finger at a 16-year-old honor student. They listened to testimony about her 7 prior accusations, all aimed at youth of color, each one dismissed when the items were later found. The verdict was swift: guilty of filing false police reports, obstruction, and reckless endangerment. Linda's tears on the stand could not wash away the pattern her record exposed. She was sentenced to 2 years probation, fined heavily, and ordered to complete 400 hours of community service with youth organizations she once vilified. The dominoes continued to fall. Mark Whitfield, the store manager, who had ordered his staff to watch kids who don't look like they belong, faced civil litigation and corporate termination. His memo became Exhibit A in a case that revealed systemic bias coded into corporate practice. His name, once hidden in internal emails, now stood as a cautionary tale in training manuals across the retail industry. And then there was Officer Daniel Briggs. In court, his smirk was gone, replaced by the clenched jaw of a man stripped bare. Captain Jordan Ruiz's documentation of Amara's injuries, Major Denise Hall's legal filings, and the unveiling of his 12 excessive force complaints painted a picture of an officer protected by silence and shielded by bureaucracy. The jury saw not just one incident, but a pattern, a career built on targeting the vulnerable. Briggs was found guilty of civil rights violations, excessive force, and falsifying reports. He was stripped of his badge, dishonored before his peers, and handed over to federal prosecutors. For the first time in 20 years, he stood not as the accuser, but as the accused. The court, however, did not stop at individual accountability. In a groundbreaking ruling, TechMart was ordered to establish a $1.5 million STEM scholarship fund in Amara's name, dedicated to supporting minority students pursuing science and technology. The company was placed under 5 years of federal oversight, required to implement anti-profiling reforms across all its nationwide locations. Independent monitors would review every policy, every complaint, every detainment, ensuring that the injustice inflicted on Amara could not quietly repeat itself. The ruling sent ripples through the corporate world, a signal that silence and settlements would no longer be shields against systemic discrimination. But perhaps the most powerful moment came not from the courtroom, but from the halls of Congress. Amara, her wrists healed, but still marked with faint scars, took a seat before a congressional committee on civil rights and commerce. Her voice, steady and precise, carried not just her own story, but the stories of countless others who never had a Delta Force colonel to call. I was 16. She began, her tone clear as glass. I came to a store for parts, to build something that would help people. Instead, I was treated like a criminal. Not because of what I did, but because of how I looked. That is the price of profiling, not just stolen dignity, but stolen futures. Lawmakers leaned in as she spoke of her humiliation, her composure, her decision not to accept silence for a price. She recounted how Linda laughed, how Whitfield ordered bias into policy, how Briggs sneered at the idea of accountability. But she also spoke of the crowd outside the mall, of the chance that turned her shame into strength, of her mother's unwavering presence. Systems don't change on their own, she concluded. They change when we refuse to let injustice be normal. Her testimony became the backbone of proposed legislation strengthening federal oversight of racial profiling in retail and law enforcement legislation that passed with bipartisan support months later. 1 year later, the transformation was visible not only in the law, but in the very place where it all began. Westfield Mall, once the site of humiliation, hosted the inaugural Amara Lewis STEM Scholars Award ceremony. The security office where she had been handcuffed was now a brightly lit community resource center, walls lined with mentoring materials and outreach posters. The same corridors where strangers once whispered behind raised phones now rang with applause as students, families, and leaders gathered to celebrate possibility, not prejudice. Amara stood at the podium in a navy blazer, her NASA pin glinting under the lights. Before her sat 10 young scholarship recipients, the first class of the Amara Lewis STEM Scholars. They were diverse in age, background, and aspiration, but all carried the spark she had nearly lost that day. Her voice, steady and passionate, echoed through the mall. A year ago, I stood in this building as a suspect, accused of theft I did not commit. Today, I stand here not as a victim, but as a witness to what resilience and accountability can build. These scholarships are not charity, they are justice. They are opportunity returned to those who should never have had it stolen in the first place. The crowd erupted in applause, tears glistening in the eyes of parents who saw their children in Amara's story. Reporters captured every word, every image, sending it out across the nation as both a reminder of what had been lost and a blueprint of what could be gained. At her side stood Colonel Patrice Lewis, no longer just a soldier in uniform, but a symbol of the power of family resilience. She did not speak that day. Her silence was intentional, allowing her daughter's voice to carry the weight of legacy. But her presence was unmistakable, tall, proud, unshaken. For the veterans in the audience, she embodied the discipline of service. For the parents, she embodied protection. For the children, she embodied the truth that no injustice, however painful, had to be the final word. As the ceremony ended, Amara clasped her mother's hand, the faint scars on her wrists meeting the calloused hands of a woman who had fought battles both abroad and at home. Together they looked out over the transformed mall, a place that had once stripped them of dignity, but now stood as a model of justice and inclusion. The message was undeniable. Personal injustice, when faced with courage and community, could become the spark for national reform. And as cameras flashed, as chants of justice for Amara rose one more time before dissolving into cheers of celebration, the story of a 16-year-old girl in handcuffs was no longer one of humiliation. It was a story of legacy reform and the unstoppable force of truth carried on the shoulders of those unwilling to be silenced. 1 year after Amara Lewis sat in a mall security office with blood running down her 16-year-old wrists, her story has grown into something larger than a single injustice. It has become a mirror for every American who has ever asked what kind of nation we truly are. The lesson is simple, but sharp systems do not collapse from a single bad day. They corrode over years when bias is excused, when 12 complaints are buried, when 7 false reports are ignored, when one manager's memo tells staff to watch kids who don't look like they belong. But the story of Amara and Colonel Patrice Lewis reminds us that silence is not destiny. One video, 37 seconds long, spread across millions of screens, sparked a protest that swelled from a few classmates to 1,000 voices demanding justice. One courtroom turned private humiliation into public reform, ordering a $1.5 million scholarship fund in Amara's name. One teenager's testimony before Congress helped pass legislation that now protects children she will never meet. And 1 year later, the very mall that once served as a stage for profiling became the site of the Amara Lewis STEM Scholars Award, where young dreamers stepped onto a platform of dignity instead of suspicion. These numbers, 12 complaints, 7 false reports, 37 seconds, $1.5 million, are not statistics alone. They are proof that injustice can be measured, exposed, and defeated when ordinary citizens refuse to look away. That is the charge to every American watching today. Do not settle for silence. Do not be bought off by comfort. Do not accept that humiliation is the cost of survival. Ask yourself, what will you do when bias shows itself in your neighborhood, your school, your store? Will you avert your eyes, or will you stand as Amara stood calm and unshaken, insisting on truth? If this story has stirred something in you, let it not end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story of courage and accountability. Like this video to show that you stand with families who demand better. Share it with friends, neighbors, and co-workers, because change spreads fastest when carried by many voices. Together we can ensure that what happened to Amara is not repeated, but remembered as the moment a nation chose dignity over derision, justice over silence, and truth over convenience.